Imagine a teenage showgirl thrust into the highest circles of British politics, only to trigger one of the nation's most explosive scandals. This is the story of Christine Keeler, whose life veered from heartbreak and hidden abuse to the center of a Cold War intrigue that toppled reputations and changed the course of history. Stay tuned, because her journey is as shocking as it is deeply human. Christine Keeler was born on February 22, 1942, in Uxbridge, Middlesex, at a time when wartime austerity still left its mark on English life. She was the daughter of Colin Keeler, who walked out on the family, and Julie Payne, but her childhood would be shaped far more by her stepfather, Edward Hewish, a man she would come to fear. Growing up in a post-war England that was short on warmth and shorter on money, Christine found herself shuffled about, hungry for a hint of care and attention. Instead, she received brutality. By the time she was 6, authorities intervened on charges of malnutrition, plucking her from home as if she were just another statistic in a dreary social welfare ledger. But that was only the start of her private tragedies. She would later claim she had been sexually assaulted by Hewish when she was only 12, a horror she could not escape in a household determined to keep secrets behind closed doors. When she ventured outside for babysitting jobs, the alleged abuse continued, this time at the hands of other predatory fathers in the neighborhood. There was no safe haven. Still, Christine survived day by day, holding on to hope that somewhere beyond the gray horizon was a better life. She left school at 15 with no qualifications and no illusions, convinced her only path forward involved getting out of Berkshire and away from the stepfather whose presence churned her stomach. London beckoned. In the late 1950s, the city still had a certain magic, even with bomb sites scattered about and an economy not yet roaring. The hum of possibilities lured her in. She was young and strikingly pretty. Delicate cheekbones, wide, expressive eyes, and a shape that turned heads whenever she walked by. She quickly realized that her looks were a sort of currency, one that could open doors she'd never known existed. So when a job opened at Murray's Cabaret Club, famed for its revealing costumes, glamorous dancers, and high society clientele, Christine jumped at the opportunity. She was barely more than a girl, dancing in skimpy outfits in front of wealthy men twice or 3 times her age, but she latched onto the wages and the glitz. After all, it was a step up from endless trauma at home. The club was a swirl of smoke, music, and swirling skirts, with an electric undertow that promised fleeting excitement. Murray's wasn't just a seedy dive bar. It was a place where politics, money, and desire mingled in a hush-hush setting. Diplomats, aristocrats, and celebrities melted together in the amber glow of stage lights. Christine learned to navigate conversations laced with flirtation and bribes, to sense the tension in the room whenever a particularly important figure arrived. The waitresses and showgirls whispered among themselves about the men who came here, about the deals or deceptions that might be orchestrated in the dark corners. For Christine, the place was a fast lesson in the power dynamic between those who have everything and those who have little. She saw that the men around her had influence, but they were also often bored, reckless, or searching for a thrill. She was just a teenage runaway, content to collect tips and keep an eye out for anything that hinted at a bigger break. She had no idea how big that break would be. By 1959, at only 17, she found herself pregnant by a U.S. serviceman who vanished. She gave birth to a premature baby boy named Peter. He died at 6 days old, never able to breathe properly. She was alone in her hospital room, grappling with heartbreak and the terrifying realization that life's cruelty came in swift jolts she could not stop. The grief stayed with her. In interviews years later, she would tear up at the mention of Peter, describing how those short days with him were the only semblance of unconditional love she had known. But she had to move on. No one was offering a safety net. London's pace doesn't slow for personal tragedy. As she tried to piece herself together emotionally, a friend mentioned a job possibility. She could model. She already had the face and figure that turned heads. Soon she was posing for pin-up photographs, sometimes topless. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay outmatched what she earned waiting tables. Some of these photos were tasteful. Others verged on soft core. Christine wasn't naive enough to think the images would vanish once the camera clicked, but in her mind they were purely transactional. She needed money, and she saw no immediate alternatives. She had few illusions about how men in her life would treat her, so if they wanted pictures of a beautiful teenager, so be it. She might as well earn a living while she had her youth. Her world changed drastically in 1961, courtesy of Stephen Ward, an osteopath and socialite who frequented the same circles as high-ranking government officials and wealthy entrepreneurs. Ward had an uncanny knack for connecting the lower rungs of society, dancers, models, showgirls, with Britain's upper crust. He took a shine to Christine, drawn to her wit and her raw kind of beauty. Perhaps he saw an opportunity to make introductions that might amuse his influential friends. Perhaps he sensed a certain vulnerability in Christine that he found both endearing and exploitable. One weekend he brought her to Cliveden House, an estate known for decadent parties hosted by Viscount Astor. The estate was a symbol of old-world opulence, replete with grand halls, lavish gardens, and staff who catered to every whim. Christine, all of 19, suddenly found herself sipping cocktails alongside members of Parliament, minor aristocrats, and a constellation of notable socialites. It was at Cliveden where she met John Profumo, Secretary of State for War in Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's Conservative government. He was in his late 40s, married to actress Valerie Hobson, and exuded the confident charm of a man used to having doors open for him. When he laid eyes on Christine, by the pool, wearing a bathing suit that revealed far more than a government minister should see, he was smitten. She might have been shy for a second, unsure how to talk to a man with such authority, but Profumo's flirtation put her at ease. She soon discovered that behind the polished veneer was a man hungry for excitement, for a break from the polite, regimented life of a politician. They began an affair. What neither Christine nor Profumo fully grasped, or maybe they chose not to notice, was the precariousness of their entanglement. Their assignations were as clandestine as possible, yet any rumor or photograph could spark a scandal. Profumo was a rising star in government. Christine was not just any showgirl. She was also known to mingle with other men, including Yevgeny Ivanov, a Soviet naval attaché widely suspected of being a KGB operative. Britain was in the midst of the Cold War, and the idea that the Secretary of State for War might be sharing pillow talk, directly or indirectly, with a possible Soviet spy was more than just gossip. It bordered on a national security threat. Christine, though, remained oblivious to the bigger political picture. She liked the attention, the fine dinners, the novelty of a man who represented power beyond her wildest imagination. At the same time, she was occasionally seeing Ivanov, who was charismatic in his own right. She never thought of herself as a spy or as someone who could unravel a government. She was a young woman still trying to outrun her own traumas, getting lost in a swirl of thrilling liaisons. The year 1962 brought warning signs that Christine's life was about to implode. Tensions boiled over one night between two of her lovers, Johnny Edgecombe and Lucky Gordon, both men with tempestuous streaks who had developed violent jealousies. Edgecombe slashed Gordon's face with a knife in October 1962. Then in December, he fired gunshots at the front door of Stephen Ward's flat, apparently aiming to get at Christine, who was inside. No one was physically harmed by the gunfire, but the noise attracted the police. Soon, inquiries about why Edgecombe was shooting started surfacing, which in turn led to questions about Christine's lifestyle, why she was at Ward's place, who else was in her orbit, and whether she was entangled with men more dangerous than a petty criminal. The police rummaged through the messy details and discovered a trail leading to Profumo. The entire Jenga tower of secrets was now swaying ominously. By early 1963, the press was on the scent. Fleet Street journalists doled out hush money to bellhops, bartenders, and doormen who might spill details about Christine's movements. Rumors flew that she'd been sleeping not just with Profumo, but with Ivanov, which implied a possible espionage ring. Stephen Ward tried to manage the crisis behind the scenes, but it was too late. The papers had a blockbuster story. A high-ranking government minister caught in a scandal with a teenage showgirl who also had ties to a Soviet official. The connotations were salacious and politically deadly. Parliament demanded answers. Profumo, in a statement that would seal his fate, denied everything. Standing before the House of Commons, he insisted there was no impropriety in his dealings with Christine Keeler. The press howled at the lie, brandishing evidence that contradicted him. Faced with the reality that he had misled Parliament and that more incriminating details would inevitably leak, Profumo resigned in June 1963. For him, it was a devastating personal blow, a collapse of his career and public standing. For Harold Macmillan's conservative government, it was a humiliating fiasco that contributed to growing public distrust and eventually the downfall of the administration. The affair became shorthand for hypocrisy, moral decay, and the vulnerability of the British ruling class. Even decades later, the Profumo affair stands as one of the country's most notorious political sex scandals, sometimes described as the moment the old Edwardian veneer truly cracked. Christine was not so lucky as to quietly resign and fade away. She became a pariah. The press rebranded her as a tart, a prostitute, a gold digger, and other slurs that hammered home the idea that she was solely responsible for the scandal. Perhaps the public wanted a scapegoat, or the media found it profitable to savage a working-class girl who had dared to consort with the rich and powerful. She had no legal team, no media-savvy advisors to help her shape the narrative. So when she faced a trial for perjury regarding her testimony in Lucky Gordon's assault case, she had omitted crucial witness information. She was basically on her own. She ended up receiving a 9-month sentence, of which she served 4.5 months in prison. It was a brutal penalty, especially considering the context. The entire British establishment seemed determined to see her punished, while the men, Profumo, Ward, at least until his own trial, and others, managed to maneuver behind the scenes. Stephen Ward, the affable fixer who introduced Christine to so many of these upper-crust circles, faced his own downfall. Charged with living off the immoral earnings of prostitution, he went to trial in what many consider a grotesque abuse of process. Christine's testimony, shaped by pressure and fear, contributed to the prosecution's case. Ward felt betrayed. He also felt persecuted by a system that needed to blame someone for the scandal. On August 3, 1963, while the trial was ongoing, Ward overdosed on barbiturates. He slipped into a coma and died a few days later. Christine carried the guilt of that for the rest of her life, feeling that her testimony had helped seal his fate, even though the entire affair was far more complex than one individual's statement. When Christine walked out of prison, she tried to resume life, but the world outside those bars was no more forgiving. Some referred to her as the face of a national disgrace. She attempted normalcy, drifting between minor jobs, hairdressing, secretarial work. But employers recognized her name. She tried to marry, first to James Livermore in 1965, and then later to Anthony Platt in 1971. But neither union lasted long. The stigma attached to her name was like a curse. The media had convinced the public she was a manipulative temptress who had seduced a cabinet minister and threatened national security. Her true backstory: childhood abuse, minimal education, a desperate search for belonging, rarely entered the conversation. Instead, society gawked at the sensational bullet points: Profumo affair, Soviet connections, scandalous photo shoots. Amid the personal chaos, Christine gave birth to 2 sons, James and Seymour. Motherhood offered some measure of hope, a chance to anchor herself with family ties. Yet over time, the relentless tabloid coverage eroded her relationships, even with her children. She tried multiple times to speak her truth publicly, giving interviews or writing memoirs, The Truth at Last, 2001, and Secrets and Lies, 2012, to explain what actually happened behind the headlines. She recounted her experiences of being used by men who wanted her beauty but not her well-being, of being vilified by the press, of living with the crushing guilt over Stephen Ward's demise. But by then, the general public had largely moved on, and the media was only interested if she offered lurid confessions or brand new shock value. She found herself labeled again and again as that woman from the Profumo scandal, as if her life had ended the moment the headlines faded. Estrangement from her sons became one of the great sorrows of her later years. They had grown tired of the stigma that followed them because of their mother's infamy. Everywhere they went, someone might recall that they were Christine Keeler's kids, the offspring of the woman labeled a prostitute and homewrecker. Worn down by constant shame, they distanced themselves from her. In interviews, Christine expressed heartbreak, saying that her past seemed to have permanently marred any chance of enjoying a peaceful family life. Society might not have been actively hounding her as it did in the 1960s, but the damage had already been done. And then there was the photograph taken in 1963 by Lewis Morley, showing Christine Keeler nude astride a plywood Arne Jacobsen chair, often misidentified as a real Jacobsen design but actually a cheaply made copy. The picture became an iconic image of the decade's sexual revolution, plastered in newspapers, magazines, and eventually in museums. It is still widely reproduced, sometimes revered as a piece of pop art brilliance, sometimes lampooned. That single snapshot, though unquestionably striking, haunted Christine, forever entangling her identity with that moment in time. It symbolized a mixture of youth, scandal, and the moral panic of the early 1960s, overshadowing whatever else she might have done with her life. She lived on the margins for decades. The money she earned was never enough to ensure comfort, and the fleeting fame from the scandal was rarely beneficial. It did not come with brand endorsements or film deals, the way modern celebrity culture sometimes rewards notorious figures. Instead, Christine found doors slammed shut. She moved frequently, adopting aliases now and then to avoid the stares of neighbors. She also struggled with smoking, a habit that eventually contributed to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. By 2017, her health was in serious decline. On December 4th of that year, she died in Farnborough, London, at age 75, succumbing to complications from COPD. Her passing was quiet, overshadowed by other news in a world that had mostly forgotten or trivialized her story. She left behind an estate valued at a mere $10,000, hardly a fortune after a lifetime spent at the epicenter of one of Britain's most seismic political uproars. She had lived in near poverty through her final years, reliant on sporadic handouts and haunted by regrets. A private funeral was held in Kent, and her ashes were scattered locally, with little fanfare. She certainly did not receive the grand tributes or official recognitions that some of the scandal's other players enjoyed. John Profumo, for instance, eventually redeemed himself through charity work and was honored by the Queen. Christine had no such second act in the eyes of the establishment. Still, a small group of loyal friends and supporters insisted she had been a victim, a scapegoat who received none of the leniency granted to powerful men. In 2025, a campaign was launched to overturn her perjury conviction, with advocates arguing that she had been coerced into giving uncertain testimony in a climate of intense pressure. They say the British legal system, mired in class prejudice and moral outrage, threw the book at her while tiptoeing around the more influential figures who had orchestrated or benefited from the scandal. Whether that campaign will succeed remains uncertain, but it highlights a shift in how history might eventually judge Christine Keeler. Perhaps future generations will see her less as a temptress who brought down a government, and more as a young woman caught in a cynical game of deflection and exploitation. Thank you for exploring Christine Keeler's turbulent story with me. If you found her tale of power, betrayal, and resilience as compelling as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden chapters of history. Join me next time, and together we'll uncover more stories that shaped our world, often in ways you'd never expect.